everyone, Shavua Tov. To everyone, I hope everyone is doing well and healthy and having fun with the new sun that's coming out. Baruch Hashem. It's really nice that the spring is coming. Pesach, Aviv Yagia, Pesach Ba. It's really wonderful. So, Shavua Tov to everyone. And we're continuing from last week. Last week, I gave an introduction about Ezra HaSofer. We discussed who he is a little bit, what he did, and I kind of ended in the middle because of Tfilat Mincha, and I would like, Birshutchem, I'd like this to continue from where I ended. We were discussing how Ezra, when he comes to Eretz Yisrael, in 457, 458, 457, we discussed that Ezra uses an act of mourning where he tears his clothes off and, plucks the hair off of his head, and he fell to the ground, and there's a lot of drama, and this drama affected many people in Yehuda, in Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Yehuda, Yerushalayim, and the area. And it illustrated to all the people living in Yerushalayim and the outskirts of Yerushalayim that there's something happening here. There's a bigger picture that they must pay attention to. And then they realized that it was necessary for the sake of Yahadut, of Judaism, to expel all of their foreign wives in order to restore the Jewish religion and the character of Yahadut. Meaning Ezra managed, as I mentioned last week, he managed to make change come that it came from them, it came from the He, though, which we're going to read mamash inside today, Perek Zayin, he could have used all of the authority that was given to him by Artaxerxes. He had a lot of power, he really did. We mentioned that he was close to the government, and he could have forced Am Yisrael to get rid of their wives. He could have said, okay, a new decree, Beit Din, you have a wife that's not Jewish, we can't trace her back, we can't find her tomb, all right? And that's it, goodbye, and kick her out. And he had the authority and he had the backing. He had the military at his hand. But instead, the Psukim basically say that they were trembling, but they were trembling not because they were scared of Ezra, but because they understood where he was coming from. And he didn't need to use his authority for that. So perhaps we can say that what was unique about Ezra in general was he managed to get Am Yisrael to internalize their own situation that they created. So they themselves understood the gravity of their bad circumstances, and Ezra wanted it to come from them. So he forced them to come and hear what he had to say, not to force them to divorce their wives. And they internalize it by themselves. And we don't see anywhere else, anywhere in the entire book of Ezra and Nechemya, where he uses his power, his authority to force a transition, the laws of Ezra, the laws of the Torah. And he used only the power of persuasion. And if you look for a moment, if you go to Ezra Perek Yud, it's very important, the last Perek Yud, the first Psukim, Pasuk Bet and Gimel, it says there, it just says mamash black and white, everything that we're saying. It says, Vaya'an Shchania ben Yechiel mibnei Eilam, Vayomer le'Ezra, Anachnu ma'alnu be'Eloheinu, Vanoshev nashim nochriyot me'amei haaretz, Ve'ata yesh mikve le'Yisrael al zot. I'm just going to read and I'll translate in a minute. Ve'ata comes from them. Ve'ata nichrot brit le'Eloheinu leotzi kol nashim ve'anolad mehem ba'atzat Adonai ve'hacharidim b'mitzvat Eloheinu ve'chatorah ye'aseh. Basically, Shchenya, who was the son of Yechiel, he was the clan of Elan. So he said to Ezra, we have broken faith with Hashem by marrying foreign women, meaning non-religious, non-Jewish women. But even so, there is still hope for Israel, they say. And then they say to Ezra, we must make a solemn promise to our God that we will send these women and their children away, which we could understand already from here, that the idea that children that come from women that are not Jewish are considered not Jewish. People always say, where did it come from? But we see black and white, where the people themselves are saying that the children that come from a non-Jewish woman are not considered Jewish. And then they say that we will do what you and others who honor Hashem command us and advise us to do. We will do what God's law demands. Now, it's interesting that when we go through it, when we get to Perek Yud, we'll notice that it does not specify whether Ezra also asked Jewish women to divorce their foreign husbands, right? That doesn't exist. And that again is one of the reasons why the Gemara discusses how in the time of Ezra, it was decided that we follow the woman and not the father. But we don't have anywhere where it says that Jewish women are supposed to divorce their husbands, because that doesn't really make a dent in the continuity of Am Yisrael. Okay. However, there was a court, a special court that was established for this purpose. Supposedly, as I mentioned, Ezra could have converted the estranged women according to Torah law. You know, right now, if you all just open the news anytime, we're discussing the problems of gerut, right? Conversions. And we have all of these differences of opinion, mainly two camps. One camp says that if you're going to convert someone, they must accept all of the Torah, Kadat Moshe veYisrael. They must follow the Torah, and they must live by the Torah and the mitzvot. You can't convert and stay chiloni. That's one opinion. The other side is saying that we have a very, very big problem. We have so many people that aren't considered Jewish, might not be considered Jewish, and they don't intend in living a real religious halachic life. But what are we going to do, right? They want to be Jewish. They assume that they're Jewish. They want to live a Jewish life, but to their understanding, Jewish life doesn't mean what an Orthodox Jew believes that Jewish life is. So we have an opinion that exists that says, you know what? It's not that we're lowering the bars, but we have to understand where people are coming from. And we need to save Am Yisrael because we have thousands, tens, if not 100,000 of kids that are problematic or that will be problematic, right? So Ezra also could have converted these women. He didn't have to break them apart. He wouldn't have to come and shout and say, okay, we have foreign women, get rid of them, expel them. He could have said, okay, we're convening a special religious court and we're going to start converting women. He didn't say that. Instead, he wanted to make Am Yisrael understand how serious and the grave mistake of intermarriage was. You can't just say, okay, let's just convert, because then people won't realize how terrible it is. You're actually ruining Am Yisrael. You really are. And perhaps in the end, the idea was intended to purify only ceremonial, meaning a formal request, devoid of action. Maybe because we don't see in the Ketuvim that it actually happened, that they actually started mass divorce and getting rid of their women. Maybe it was just done as a ceremony to show and to explain how terrible it is intermarriage. I mean, look what's happening now in Chutz La'aretz, in America, and in England, and all in Australia, all these places. The intermarriage is so high, so much so that the Pew came out and said that in 3, 4, I don't know how many generations, millions of Jews won't be Jewish anymore. That's just because of intermarriage. So maybe Ezra held this big, grand ceremony in order to emphasize the prohibition of such a marriage. And in practice, the women were not expelled. Maybe not. Maybe some of them were actually meguyar and properly unconverted. Maybe there were some women that didn't know about Yahadut and they wanted to become Jewish and everything that it meant, right? Maybe. I don't know. The Ketuvim don't give us that information. we just see how important it is for Ezra to make an extremely big, dramatic a ceremony about how terrible it is. And it really is terrible. In a way, I heard once Harav Yuval Sherlo, he's one of the Rabbeim, he lives in Efrat, Talmid Chacham, and he said, I heard him, he said one time that the biggest Holocaust in today's modern era is intermarriage. It's the biggest Holocaust. It's not new. This is not new. Jews constantly always want to marry the Goyim. Look what's happening now in the world today, right? So we're going to ask that question a bit later when we get to Nechemya, because Nechemya also deals with intermarriage, so we can understand that it didn't evaporate.
So they didn't actually send them all away?
There's no evidence. All we have is the ceremony. All we have, we're going to learn the text, but we're going to see then when Nechemya comes, which is a little bit later, he also has a problem of intermarriage, which we understand from that it was either unsuccessful the first time, or that it was meant to really explain to Am Yisrael the severity of intermarriage. But you know, think of how terrible it is to rip families apart, families that might even have children. It's not something that Ezra wants to do. Start ripping families apart from each other, people who might be in love and might establish a good family union, and all of a sudden, because someone is not considered Jewish, now we got to rip them apart. That's what we're dealing with today, in today's day and age, with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of couples that are married, and then all of us, I'll tell you a story, a real story. I might have said this story before, a real story. I had a talmidah, a student of mine, who, as far as I understood, was totally religious. You know, she davened and she learned. She even learned Gemara a little bit, and she knew Tanakh and she knew Halacha, and she came from a good religious family. And she was in Israel and she got engaged to a Chabadnik, right? A religious guy, Chabadnik from actually a very, very well-known family. And they wanted to get married, so they asked me to officiate the wedding. Of course, for a Talmid, I drop everything, and of course, I want to help them as much as I can. So I sent them to the Rabbanut to open up a tik, and then all of a sudden, literally a couple of days later, she calls me crying on the phone, crying. And I said, "Why are you crying? What happened?" And she said, with broken sentences, that she was just told that she's not Jewish. I said, "What do you mean you're not Jewish? Of course you're Jewish. I know you. You're Jewish. You know Torah and halacha." I said, No. The dayan there said I am not Jewish. I'm mamash not Jewish, and therefore the mishpacha of the Chabadnik is trying to create rift between them and make sure that they don't get married. Terrible story, mamash.
So what happened?
I'll tell you.
What was no?
I'll tell you. So I immediately called the dayan. He wasn't a dayan. He was a secretary, and I asked to speak to the dayanim. And the answer I got was, well, the dayanim said she's not Jewish. She's not Jewish. And I almost yelled. People know me. I don't yell, but I raised my voice and said, "How dare you say to somebody you're not Jewish?" What you should have said, and therefore I wanted to talk to the dayanim. You should have said, "We found a technical glitch. We found something that we need to check out and try to solve." And then I got to the dayanim and I spoke to them, and they realized what was going on. Mahaya, what happened was that this woman, this one of my talmidah, basically her mother converted. And she didn't even know, her mother, who is Orthodox, but when she converted, did not know that a conservative conversion is not considered a conversion. But after she converted to Judaism through a conservative conversion, she was Orthodox. She went to an Orthodox shul. She sent my Talmidah to an Orthodox school. But they didn't know there was a glitch. So I told the dayanim, this woman, my Talmidah, has only known Orthodoxy. So you don't tell somebody you're not Jewish, even though technically maybe they're right. I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know what they did not do, right? So I said, let's find a solution. Now I could have been like Ezra. But I don't believe that Ezra said we're breaking people apart in things like this. So the solution that we did, just so you could know the end of the story, is basically we did a giyur lechumra in the night of the actual mikvah that you have to go to anyway to get married. So basically what we did is every woman has to go to the mikvah before she gets married. So what I did is I ensured that mikvah, going to the mikvah before getting married, is also the giyur lechumra, which means that it also counted as a giyur. And of course, you did not have to go through a beit din of learning anything or anything like that. I actually, Baruch Hashem, they considered me enough to be in the beit din, so I was a dayan there as well to help out. But think of what Ezra went through. People living together in Yerushalayim, thinking they're Jewish, not knowing that they're not even Jewish, living a life, for all we know, going up to the Beit HaMikdash to give offerings, and then all of a sudden he comes and he wants to tear them apart. You can't do that. So maybe it was only ceremonial. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe he really did. I don't know. The text doesn't tell us. All I know is that later in Nechemya's time, we still have the problem of intermarriage, which means it doesn't go away. It really doesn't. So perhaps Ezra, maybe on the flip side, he conceptualized that only the people from the galut, the diaspora, who went through the galut, are considered the zera kadosh, which is one of the terms used, while the women who stayed in Israel and the men who stayed in Israel are foreigners. We don't know what happened to them. Intermarriage, the Shomronim, who knows? So this episode of intermarriage, which is huge, is one of the important things that Ezra did. Now, we're going to learn a lot of things that Ezra did besides that, but that's one of the things that the text really emphasizes.
So they got married and they're still married and they have a family. And what happened to her mother and the siblings in that family?
Talking about my student, yes, Baruch Hashem, they're married, they have 5 kids, everything is a great ending, Baruch Hashem.
And what about her siblings?
I don't know. I don't know.
And her mother? All right, I'll let it go. It's just like it's bigger than the 2 sentences you gave us.
Yeah, this is not the noseh, but I will say that I will say one thing. This shows you how important this topic of conversion is all about. It's not simple. It really isn't simple. You have Rabbeim on one side and some on the other side. This fight is not political. I don't believe it's political. I really believe 2 sides truly believe in what they're saying. I'm sure there's some politics with some people because of chairs and who gets to be in the court and who gets a job, etc. But I know this. I'm part of 2 different sides that one believes that we have to find a solution and the other says it doesn't matter. Conversion means accepting Torah mitzvot as is 613. But we have a problem. So not for now. But we see that Ezra Sofer also had this problem. There's another very big, important, that has to do with Torah, also that Ezra deals with. Ezra, we know, is a scribe. Ezra HaSofer, right? He's fast with the scribe, mahir. So he worked, that we're going to see, he works hard to spread the Torah. After all, the very existence of Jewish law, halacha, already existed. It was known, right? Because, how do we know that it was known? Because that when Ezra got the license, which we're going to read mamash in the beginning of Perek Zayin, when he gets the license by Artaxerxes to go to Eretz Israel and reshape the Jewish spiritual character, he was given explicitly, it was said that Ezra was given authority to teach Torah law to Israel, according to the commandments, mitzvot, which means that even Artaxerxes knew about Torah mitzvot. So here too, Ezra could have used brute force to instill in Israel Torah Israel. By the way, also a very hot topic of kfiyah datit. Kfiyah datit. Do I force Torah on Eretz Israel, on Medinat Israel, or do I not force Torah? Do I say no transportation on Shabbat, or do I let people in Tel Aviv have transportation? Right? Do I force people to get married according to Torah Israel, Chupah v'Kiddushin? Or do I say we can have civil? What do I do when it comes to a place where we have lots of Jews, lots of different ideas? We have that problem today. So did Ezra. He was given the charter, he was given the authority to force Torah Israel. He could have enacted a law requiring that everyone must live according to the Torah. But instead, in a very creative way, somehow, Ezra succeeds in making the people ask him to read the Torah because they want to know what the Torah says. Halavai aleinu, that in today's day and age, we'd have some sarim in the memshala and some very powerful people come to us and say, look, I see that you really feel connected to this Torah. Read the Torah to me. I want to know what it says. Maybe it's worth it. There's a lot of chokhmah in the Torah. A lot of goyim say there's a lot of chokhmah in the Torah. But for some reason, we have people within, because we are our greatest enemies, who don't even care. So Ezra so creatively make sure that he doesn't force it on them, because he knows what happens with Jews when you force things on Jews. They just, they go the other way around. He forces it and says, I want to make it come. Sorry, he doesn't force, but he somehow makes it come from them. In Nechemya, if you have your Tnachim, in Nechemya, this is the last time we're going to jump and we're going to go to Perek Zayin. In Nechemya Perek Chet, the first psukim, Perek Aleph, and until Gimel, it says there, I'm going to read, Vayeasfu kol ha'am ki'ish echad el harechov asher lifnei sha'ar hamayim. We'll see what that is when we get there. Vayomru le'Ezra hasofer, they said, lehavi et sefer Torat Moshe asher tziva Adonai et Yisrael. ויביא עזרא הכהן את התורה לפני הקהל, מאיש ועד אישה, וכל מבין לשמוע ביום אחד לחודש השביעי. ויקרא בו לפני הרחוב, אשר לפני שער המים, מן האור עד מחצית היום, נגד האנשים והנשים והמבינים, ואוזני כל העם אל ספר התורה. So they gather in Yerushalayim, in the square, just inside a gate called the Water Gate. See what that is. I'll show you maps when you get there. And they asked Ezra, who was a priest, a Kohen. We'll see that in a second. He was a scholar. He was known, Ezra Sofer, a scholar of the law, which Hashem had given Am Yisrael. And he said to him, please bring out the book, bring out the Sefer Torah, the laws. So Ezra brings out the Sefer Torah in that place where they were all gathered, men, women, children who were old enough to understand. And there, in the middle of the square, by the gate, he read out loud the Torah from dawn until noon. And they all listened attentively. Think of that happening in the middle of Tel Aviv. We open up, I don't mean to say, to talk against Tel Aviv. I really don't. I'm just giving it as an example, right? In the middle of Tel Aviv, you open up a Sefer Torah and you're reading, and then all of a sudden, all these people are gathering. People don't even know what Rosh Hashanah is. People don't know what Yom Kippur is. They're gathering, they're listening and saying, wow, what great chokhmah. That's what he succeeded in doing. What a brilliant man. So in addition to reading the Torah, Ezra also brought back Rosh Hashanah and the celebration of Sukkot in Yerushalayim. Aliyah Regel. Ezra really wanted, and he prayed, that the Jewish people return not only to observance of the commandments, but also to enjoy being Jewish and religious, pleasurable. Now, with all of the powers and authority he had, he didn't activate those powers, the authority that he had. So it's in my opinion that this is Ezra's approach to leadership. He chooses persuasion that is supposed to stimulate the human soul, mamash, because he believes that the only way that he can reach the neshamot is through tshuva, that they come back instead of coercion. Coercion doesn't help. Change has to come from within the people. And Ezra had a great personality to make that happen. He was as great as Moshe Rabbeinu was. He really, really was. His actions related to the masses, to all of Am Yisrael, to the public, starting with the expulsion of women collectively. Whether it happened or not, he made them understand what family purity is. He read the Torah out loud through like mamash. He read all the mitzvot, and he believed that the centrality of the Torah could be changed and restored to Am Yisrael. That is really who Ezra Sofer is. A great personality, one that cared so much about Am Yisrael and didn't stop until he made a dent in what we have today, which is Mamash Torah Mitzvot. So let's go right into Perek Zayin and Mamash starts. Perek Zayin Pasuk Aleph. With all of the packed information we have, this should be pretty easy. ואחר הדברים האלה, במלכות ארתחשסתא מלך פרס, עזרא בן סריה, בן עזריה, בן חלקיה, בן שלום, בן צדוק, בן אחיטוב, בן אמריה, בן עזריה, בן מריות, בן זרחיה, בן עוזי, בן בוקי, בן אבישוע, בן פנחס, בן אלעזר, בן אהרון הכהן הראש. So who was Ezra? He was Zera Aharon HaKohen, which means he himself is a Kohen, maybe even a Kohen Gadol. We'll see later on, according to Divrei Hayamim, we don't see anywhere that he's seen as a Kohen Gadol. Mamash. But he was definitely a Kohen. Who? Ezra, this figure, this person that we read up until now for 6 prakim, we read about everything that happened before he was born. Now finally we're meeting the man himself. Alami Bavel v'hu sofer mahir betorat Moshe asher natan Adonai Elohei Yisrael vayiten lo hamelech yad Adonai Elohav alav kol bakashato. So many years later, because we're talking about 458, recall, we ended last Perek 517. We finished with Daryavesh. We finished with building the Beit HaMikdash, and all of a sudden we have all this time that is unaccounted for. And I said, this time is also when Achashverosh and Haman and Esther happened. But what was going on in Eretz Yisrael? Intermarriage. People didn't have leadership. When there's void leadership, when there's no actual leader that's doing what it should be doing, Am Yisrael, they dissipate, they fall apart, and people started marrying other women and forming families. How did they live? What kind of family unit did they have? Did they observe Shabbat? Did they observe Kashrut? We don't know. All we know is that Ezra was called. We mentioned this last week. He was called by people living in Eretz Yisrael in Yerushalayim, saying, "We need your help. We need leadership." And he picks up and he leaves and he comes to Eretz Yisrael. And it's interesting how the Torah, the Ketuvim tell us where he comes from. I want to share my screen for a moment, just so you can see the scope of where he comes from. It's nice to see the lineage of where really he comes from. So we just read, you can see on my screen, Ezra ben Seraya ben Azariah ben Chilkiah. So I was wondering where he came from. So I went to Divrei Hayamim, and in Divrei Hayamim, as you can see, Perek Aleph, Perek Hey, you have the entire, let me just all the way from Bnei Amram, Aaron and Moshe, all the way to Seraya. We just mentioned that Ezra ben Seraya. So I tried to find out, who he is exactly. So I found in Divrei Hayamim that there's a guy called Seraya, but this Seraya can't be Ezra's father, even though it goes all the way back to Aaron HaKohen. Why? Because this Seraya, Ezra ben Seraya, over here, Holid et Yehotzadak. And if this is true, if Seraya also gave birth to Yehotzadak, a Kohen Gadol, which means that Ezra is Yehotzadak's brother, right? Because we saw over here, Ezra ben Seraya. So therefore, maybe it's this guy. And if that's so, then it's true. But in Melachim Bet, those who learn Melachim with me would probably remember this, which is the last parak of Melachim. It says, B'mifurash, that Seraya HaKohen HaRosh, which is this guy over here, was killed. Vayach otam melech Bavel vayimitem berivla. During the time of Girush Yehuda, the exile by Melech Bavel, he was killed. Tzraya was killed. So it can't be that Ezra, many years later, we're talking about 580 BCE. That's when Tzraya was killed, and Ezra is over 100 years later coming to Israel. It cannot be his son. Doesn't work out. The math doesn't work. I also noticed that there is another Tzraya mentioned in Ezra Perek Bet. Again, a different Tzraya, not this Tzraya over here, and a different Tzraya because it says here they came down with Zerubbabel, so this guy is alive. He wasn't killed. Tzraya. So it could be that there's a lot of different Tzrayas, and it could be that the Tzraya that Ezra comes from isn't the Tzraya mentioned in the pasuk over here that we just opened and said. So what I did is I went to Divrei Hayamim. You could see in front of you, and this is the generations from Aaron HaKohen all the way down to Tzraya. And if you count what we have in Divrei Hayamim, you'll notice that our Perek Zayin, is missing a couple of people. So I made a comparison, right? So Divrei Hayamim, let me just get my my laser. So Divrei Hayamim up here start with Aaron, just like Ezra does, and this is all okay. As Aaron, Elazar, Pinchas, Avishua, Boki, Uzziah, Zachariah. But then all of a sudden, we skip all these people. These people don't exist in our Perek. And then we continue from Azariah all the way down to Saraya, but we don't have Yotzadak either. The question is, why are we missing people? And there are a couple of reasons, a couple of Perushim, but one of the reasons is a simple reason. And that is that he doesn't really, this is Ezra. Ezra doesn't need us to know exactly where he comes from father to son, as long as we understand that he comes all the way back to Aaron HaKohen. And he's a Kohen, meaning he is Ohev Shalom, Rodef Shalom. He wants Leman Tovat Am Yisrael. And when we look at the psukim, when we make a comparison, we can see it doesn't really matter. What matters is who is Ezra, a great man, and he has the backing of where he comes from. So what does he do? Pasuk Zayin. Sorry, Pasuk Vav. Who is Ezra? Oops, I'm sorry. The end of Pasuk Vav says, "Vayiten lo hamelech ki yad Adonai Elohav alav kol bakashato." Everything that Ezra wanted, Artashasta gave him. Pasuk Zayin. ויעלו מבני ישראל ומן הכהנים והלוויים והמשוררים והשוערים והנתינים אל ירושלים. When? בשנת 7 לארתחשסתא המלך. So all these people, Ezra, who was a scholar and knowledgeable in the law of the Torah, and he sets out from Bavel to Yerushalayim with a group of important people. He's not just coming down with Amcha, the way we saw that happened with Zerubbabel. He's coming down with other Kohanim, with Leviim. He comes down with musicians, with Leviim musicians, Meshorerim, who can come and spark spirituality. You know, I think it was 1980, 1990, I can't remember. It was one of the first times I went to the first Kabbalat Shabbat of Carlebach. Not going to talk about Carlebach, but about the Kabbalat Shabbat, which was something very new, singing and everything. And it rejuvenated our connection to beautiful Kabbalat Shabbat, even though I very much like the traditional one as well. What Ezra wanted to do, it wasn't just forcing Torah, he wanted to bring back Yahadut. He wanted to bring back the love of Yahadut, the spirit of Yahadut. He wanted to bring back the music of the Leviim, not just the Avodah, but he wanted everything to be beautiful and everything to sound beautiful. And he brings down when? Bishnat Sheva le'artachshasta. First day of the month, right? Vayavo Yerushalayim b'chodesh hachamishi ki shnat hashvi'it למלך. כי באחד לחודש הראשון הוא יוסד המעלה מבבל, ובאחד לחודש החמישי בא אל ירושלים כיד אלוהיו הטובה עליו. So they left Bavel on the first day of the first month. With Hashem's help, they arrived in Yerushalayim, the first day of the fifth month. Pasuk Yud, Ki Ezra Heichin Levavo, it's beautiful. Heichin Levavo Lidrosh et Torat Adonai Vela'asot Ulelamed BeYisrael Chok Umishpat. Ezra had devoted his life to studying the law of the Torah only so that he can bring it forward, so he can infuse Am Yisrael with that Torah, so they can practice it, so he can teach it to them, and all of its religious practices. Le'am Yisrael, le'lamed Yisrael chok u'mishpat. It doesn't say anywhere that he came to be a manhig. It doesn't say that he came to sit on a throne. It doesn't say that he came to get money. It doesn't say that he wanted to control everything, even though he had all of the authority. He wanted his heart, he wanted to open his heart to Am Yisrael. And starting from Pasuk Yud Aleph, you can see it's in Aramaic, Yud Aleph, all the way to Pasuk Kaf Vav, is basically the charter, the actual harsha'a. What permissions was he given? So we're going to only have time now just to tap into the first couple of psukim before we go to Mincha. But Baruch Hashem, Mincha is already later, and next week it shouldn't bother us at all. So let's read inside. I'm just going to translate just for the sake of time. So try to follow me if you have your Tanachim open in Pasuk Yud Aleph. Okay, I'm going to just read the English, the translation, and hopefully we'll follow that. So Pasuk Yud Aleph. So the king Artaxerxes gave the following document, the following harsha'a, Parshegen Anishtivan, the document that gives him all the authority to Ezra, who was a Kohen. Okay, Ezra HaKohen HaSofer. Now we know he's a Kohen because we just said he comes from Aaron HaKohen, and he was a scholar who had a thorough knowledge of the laws and commandments of Am Yisrael. Pasuk Yud Bet 12. From this king Artaxerxes, right? So think of a guy standing up and reading a document. From the king Artaxerxes to HaKohen Ezra, scholar in the law of the gods of heaven, right? Elah Shmaya, that's how the Persians called our God, the gods of heavens, right? We saw that before also with Dariyavish, because they were good people who believed that there are lots of different gods, and they wanted us to be able to follow our God. They didn't think that our God is the only God. They assumed he's one of the gods. And then in Pasuk Yud Gimel, he says the following: I command that throughout my empire, all of the Israelite people, all of the Kohanim, all the Leviim that desire be permitted to go with you to Yerushalayim. Deja vu, someone? We've had this before with Zerubbabel and Sheshbatzar. We had this before, where any and all Jews were able to go. How many Jews do you think decided to go with Ezra and make Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael? Not going to ruin it for you, but I'll just say not many.
42,360.
Not many. We'll discuss it.
No, not many.
Not many.
Only 30,000 were Yisraelim. The other 12,000 were gatekeepers, were Netunim or something from the Givonim, who we can't trust to begin with. And we had Leviim, we had Kohanim, it was quite a story. And that Ezra brought them all, and I don't know if all of them were kosher either. Do you?
Well, we're just going to have to see next week, aren't we?
I guess.
So Be'ezrat Hashem, We will conclude Perek Zayin, a very, very important Perek. We will conclude with all of the Nishtevan, the document that was given to him. We'll see how many people he really came up to Eretz Yisrael with, and we need to discuss what is the reason why Jews don't want to come to Eretz Yisrael. Something we need to deal with, something that is happening today, mamash. We see that the problems that he dealt with, same problems that we deal with: intermarriage, Torah, not wanting to make aliyah. I mean, those are the three. I mean, if you think about what's the three biggest problems we all have: achdut, right? We see that also here. Aliyah, we see that here. Intermarriage, bechutz la'aretz is too much, and Torah, mamash. Those three things, and this we're talking about over 2,500 years ago. History. So we have to learn from our history. Be'ezrat Hashem. So wishing everyone a wonderful week. And as I said before, to all those who joined, please ask any questions you have regarding Pesach earlier on, so that I can try to help you as to the best of my ability. So Shavua Tov, and enjoy the week. And I'll see you all next week. Be'ezrat Hashem.